So this is a talk called Hyperobjects. I'm just going to go straight into it. So sustainable capitalism might be one of those contradictions in terms, along the lines of military intelligence. Capital must keep on producing more of itself in order to continue to be itself. This strange paradox is fundamentally structurally imbalanced. Let's consider the unit of capitalism, the turning of raw materials into products. Now, for a capitalist, the raw materials are not strictly natural. They simply pre-exist whatever labour process the capitalist is going to exert on them. Surely here we see the problem. Whatever pre-exists the specific labour process is a kind of lump that only achieves definition as valuable product once the labour has been exerted on it. What capitalism makes is some kind of stuff called capital. The very definition of raw materials in economic theory is also stuff that comes in through the factory door. Again, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be sharks or it could be steel bolts. At either end of the process, we have featureless chunks of stuff. One of those featureless chunks being human labour. The point is to convert the stuff that comes in to money. Industrial capitalism is philosophy incarnate in stocks, girders, and human sweat. What kind of philosophy? If you want a realism of the remainder, just look around you. Realism of the remainder means that yes, for sure, there is something real outside our human access to it, but we can only classify it as a kind of inert resistance to our probing, a grey goo. I'm using a term suggested by thinking about nanotechnology, tiny machines eating everything until it becomes said goo. It's no wonder that industrial capitalism has turned the earth into a dangerous desert. It doesn't really care what comes through the factory door, just as long as it generates more capital. Do we want to sustain a world based on a philosophy of grey goo? Nature is the featureless remainder at either end of the process of production. Either it's exploitable stuff or value-added stuff, whatever. It's basically featureless, abstract, grey. It has nothing to do with nematode worms and orangutans, organic chemicals in comets, and rock strata. You can scour the earth from mountaintop to Marianas Trench. You will never find nature. It's an empty category looking for something to fill it. Grey goo. Capitalism did away with feudal and pre-feudal myths, such as the divine hierarchy between classes of people. In so doing, however, it substituted one heck of a giant myth of its own, nature. Nature is precisely the lump that pre-exists the capitalist labour process. Martin Heidegger has the best term for it, standing in reserve, Bestand. Bestand means stuff. As in the old ad from the 1990s, drink Pepsi, get stuff. There is an ontology implicit in capitalist production, then, which is strictly materialism, as defined by Aristotle. Funnily enough, however, this materialism isn't fascinated with material objects in all their manifold specificity. It's just stuff. This viewpoint is the basis of Aristotle's problem with materialism. Have you ever seen or handled matter? Have you ever held a piece of stuff? Sure, I've seen lots of objects. Santa Claus in a department store, snowflakes and photographs of atoms, but I have never seen matter or stuff as such. Aristotle says it's a bit like searching through a zoo to find the animal, rather than the various species such as monkeys and mynah birds. Marx says exactly the same thing regarding capital. As nature goes, so goes matter. The two most progressive physical theories of our age, quantum theory and ecology, need have nothing to do with it. What is Bestand? Bestand is stockpiling. Row upon row of big box houses waiting to be inhabited, terabyte after terabyte of memory waiting to be filled. Stockpiling is the art of the zeugma, the art of yoking things you hear in phrases such as wave upon wave or bumper to bumper. Stockpiling is the dominant mode of social existence. Giant parking lots empty of cars. Huge tables in restaurants across which you can't hold hands. Vast empty lawns. Nature is stockpiling. Range upon range of mountains receding into the distance. Rocky Flats nuclear bomb trigger factory was cited precisely to evoke this kind of mountainous stockpile. The eerie strangeness of this fact confronts us with the ways in which we still believe that nature is over there, that it exists apart from our technology, apart from history. Far from it. Nature is the stockpile of stockpiles. So I ask again, what exactly are we sustaining when we talk about sustainability? an intrinsically out-of-control system that sucks in grey goo at one end and pushes out grey value at the other. It's natural goo, natural value. Result? Mountain ranges of inertia, piling higher every year while humans boil away in the agony of uncertainty. Just take a look at manufactured landscapes, that ocean of telephone dials, dials as far as the eye can see, somewhere in China. A real ocean. It lies there at this very moment. So this is much, much more than just instrumentality. Okay? And here we have to depart from Heidegger, because what's really going on is the localization of an essence that is beyond any specific existence. In other words, capitalism as such is Heideggerian. So the problem is not exactly that it accumulates stuff in reserve. That's an old argument about capitalism. It's bad because we save stuff, What's bad is that it posits an essence beyond, right? Either it says there's no essence, so what's here has no essence, or the essence is beyond, right? Same thing, really. So, meanwhile, despite nature, one of those essences that's beyond, despite grey goo, real things writhe and smack into one another. Some leap out because industry malfunctions, or functions only too well. Oil bursts out of its ancient sinkhole and floods the Gulf of Mexico. Gamma rays shoot out of plutonium for 24,000 years. Hurricanes congeal out of massive storm systems, fed by the heat from the burning of fossil fuels. The ocean of telephone dials mounts ever higher. Paradoxically, capitalism has unleashed a myriad objects upon us in their manifold horror and sparkling splendor. 200 years of idealism, 200 years of seeing humans at the center of existence, and now the objects take revenge. Terrifyingly huge, ancient, long-lived, threateningly minute, invading every cell in our body. When we flush the toilet, we imagine that the U-bend takes the waste away into some ontologically alien realm. Ecology is now beginning to tell us something very different. A flattened world without ontological U-bends. A world in which there is no away. When I hear the word sustainability, I reach for my sunscreen. It's October 2010. You're waiting at a bus stop. Someone else ambles up. Nice weather, isn't it? She asks. You pause for a moment. You wonder whether she is only saying that to distract you from the latest news about global warming. You decide she isn't. Yes, you say. But your reply holds something back. The awareness that for you it's not a particularly nice day because you are concerned that the heat and moisture have to do with global warming. This holding back may or may not be reflected in your tone. Mind you, she says. Oh, here it comes, you think. Funny weather last week, wasn't it? I blame global warming. We all have conversations that are more or less like that now. Just as after 9/11 objects to which we may have paid attention, an X-Acto knife, some white powder, suddenly gained a terrible significance, so in the age of global warming, the weather, that nice neutral backdrop that you can talk about with a stranger, in that nice neutral backdrop-y way that we might call thetic after Roman Jakobson, has taken on a menacing air. In any weather conversation, one of you is going to mention global warming at some point, or you both decide not to mention it, but it looms over the conversation anyway, like a dark cloud brooding off the edge of an ellipsis. This failure of the normal rhetorical routine, these remnants of shattered conversation lying around like broken hammers, they must take place everywhere, is a symptom of a much larger and deeper ontological shift in human awareness, which in turn is a symptom of a profound upgrade of our ontological tools. As anyone who has waited while the little rainbow circle goes round and round on a Mac can testify, these upgrades are not necessarily pleasant. It is very much the job of humanists such as ourselves to attune ourselves to the upgrading process and to help explain it. What is the upgrading process? In a word, the notion that we are in a world. One that, for instance, we can call nature. This notion no longer exists in any meaningful sense, except as nostalgia or in the temporarily useful local language of pleas and petitions. We don't want a certain species to be farmed to extinction, so we use the language of nature to convince a legislative body. We have a general feeling of ennui and malaise and create nostalgic visions of hobbit-like worlds to inhabit. These syndromes have been going on now since as long as the Industrial Revolution began to take effect. As a consequence of that revolution, however, something far bigger and more threatening is looming on our horizon. Looming so as to abolish our horizon, or any horizon, in fact. Global warming, the consequence of runaway fossil fuel burning, as we all know ad nauseam, has performed a radical shift in the status of weather. Why? Because the world, as such, not just a certain idea of world, but world in its entirety, has evaporated. Or rather, we are realizing that we never had it in the first place. We could explain this in terms of the good old-fashioned Aristotelian view of substance and accidents. I'm sure you're familiar with the idea that for Aristotle, a realist, there are substances that happen to have various qualities or accidents that are not intrinsic to their substantiality. In section Epsilon 2 of the Metaphysics, Aristotle outlines the difference between substances and accidents. What climate change has done is shift the weather from accidental to substantial. Here's Aristotle. Suppose, for instance, that in the season of the cynosure, the dog days of summer, Arctic cold were to prevail. This we would regard as an accident, whereas if there were a sweltering heat wave, we would not, and this is because the latter, unlike the former, is always, or for the most part, the case. But these sorts of violent changes are exactly what global warming predicts. So every accident of the weather becomes a potential symptom of a substance, global warming. So all of a sudden, this wet stuff falling on my head is a mere feature of some much more sinister phenomenon that I can't see with my naked human eyes. I need terabytes of RAM processing speed to model it in real time. They were just able to do this in spring 2008. There is an even spookier problem with Aristotle's Arctic summer. If those Arctic summers continue in any way, and if we can model them as symptoms of global warming, it is the case that there never was a genuine, meaningful, for us humans, that is, sweltering summer, just a long period of sweltering that seemed real because it kept on repeating, say, for 2 or 3 millennia. Global warming, in other words, plays a very mean trick. It reveals that what we took to be a reliable world was actually just a habitual pattern. A collusion between forces such as sunshine and moisture and us humans expecting such things at certain regular intervals and giving them names, such as dog days. We took weather to be real, but in an age of global warming we see it as an accident, a simulation of something darker, more withdrawn, climate. As Graham Harman argues, world is always presence at hand, a mere caricature of some real object. So much for substance and accidents. Now let's think of the evaporation of world from the point of view of foreground and background, those tools of Gestalt psychology. The weather and the weather conversation provide a nice background to our daily affairs, nice to the extent that we don't pay too much attention to it. Precisely for it to be a background, it has to operate in our peripheral vision, as it were. Thus, the conversation about the weather with a stranger is a safe way to acknowledge our coexistence in social space. It's phatic, according to Roman Jakobson's 6-part model of communication. That is, it draws attention to the material medium in which the communication is occurring. You know, so you talk on a microphone, check, check. You're drawing attention to the medium in which the communication is occurring. Weather conversation is drawing attention to the material medium in which your communication is occurring. The weather as such, likewise, is a nice background phenomenon. It might loom distressingly into the foreground as a tornado or as a drought, but most often those are temporary affairs. There is a larger temporal backdrop against which they seem to occur as isolated incidents. Now what happens when global warming enters the scene? The background ceases to be a background because we have started to observe it. Strange weather patterns and carbon emissions acted on scientists to start monitoring things that at first only appeared locally significant. That's the old definition of climate. There's the climate in Peru, for instance, the climate on Long Island. But climate in general, climate is the totality of derivatives of weather events, in much the same way as inertia is a derivative of velocity. Climate as such is a beast newly recognized via the collaboration of weather, satellites, scientists, government agencies, and so on. This beast includes the sun, since it's infrared heat from the sun that is trapped by the greenhouse effect of gases such as CO2. So global warming is a colossal entity. that includes entities that exist way beyond Earth's atmosphere, and yet it affects us intimately right here and now. Global warming is a prime example of what I now call a hyperobject. An object that is massively distributed in space-time, an object that radically transforms our ideas of what an object is. It covers the entire surface of the Earth and extends forwards perhaps 1,500 years into the future. Remember what life was like in 1010? The spooky thing is we discover global warming precisely when it's already here. It's like realizing that for some time you had been conducting your business in the expanding sphere of a slow-motion nuclear bomb. You have a few seconds for amazement as the fantasy that you inhabited a neat, seamless little world melts away. All those apocalyptic narratives of doom about the end of the world are, from this point of view, part of the problem, not part of the solution. By postponing doom into some hypothetical future, these narratives inoculate us against the very real object that has intruded into ecological, social, and psychic space. If there is no background, no neutral peripheral stage of weather, but a very visible, highly monitored, publicly debated climate, then there is no foreground. Foregrounds need backgrounds to exist. So the strange effect of dragging weather phenomena into the foreground as part of our awareness of global warming has been the gradual realization that there is no foreground. The idea that we are embedded in a phenomenological life world, for instance, tucked up like hobbits into the safety of our burrow, has been exposed as a fiction. The specialness we granted ourselves as unravelers of cosmic meaning, Heideggerian Dasein, for instance, falls apart, since there is no meaningfulness possible in a world without a foreground-background distinction. Worlds need horizons, and horizons need backgrounds, which need foregrounds. When we can see everywhere, when I can Google Earth the fish in my mum's pond in her garden in London, that's actually not a great picture of it, but there are Google Maps images where I can see the fish in her fish pond. The world, as a significant bounded horizoning entity, disappears. World turns out to be an aesthetic effect based on a kind of blurriness, an aesthetic distance. This blurriness derives from an entity's ignorance concerning objects. Only in ignorance can objects act like blank screens for the projection of meaning. Red Sky at Night, Shepherd's Delight, is a charming old saw that evokes days when shepherds lived in worlds. Worlds bounded by horizons on which things occurred, such as red sunsets. The sun goes up, the sun goes down. Of course, now we know it doesn't. So Galileo and Copernicus tore big holes in that particular notion of world. Likewise, as soon as humans know about climate, weather becomes a flimsy, superficial appearance that is a mere local representation of some much larger phenomenon that is strictly invisible. You can't see or smell climate. Given our brain's processing power, we can't even really think about it all that concretely. You could say then that we still live in a world, only massively upgraded. True, but now world means significantly less than it used to. It doesn't mean significant for humans, or even significant for conscious entities. A simple experiment demonstrates plainly that world is an aesthetic phenomenon. I call it the Lord of the Rings versus the ball popper. For this experiment, you will need a copy of the second part of Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy. You will also require a place called Busy Ball Popper made by Hasbro. This experiment was first done by my son. Now play the scene that I consider to be the absolute nadir of horror, when Frodo, captured by Faramir, is staggering around the bombed-out city Osgiliath when a Nazgul, a ringwraith, attacks on a fell beast, a terrifying winged dragon-like creature. Switch on the ball popper. You will notice the inane tunes that the popper plays instantly undermine the coherence of Peter Jackson's narrative world. I can't begin to... It's sort of... And there's this dragon thing. Oh my God! The idea of world depends on all kinds of mood lighting and mood music, aesthetic effects that by definition contain a kernel of sheer ridiculous meaninglessness. It's the job of serious Wagnerian worlding to erase the trace of this meaninglessness. Jackson's trilogy surely is Wagnerian, a total work of art or Gesamtkunstwerk in which elves, dwarves and men have their own languages, their own tools, their own architecture. This is done to fascist excess, as if they were all different sports teams. But it's easy to recover the trace of meaninglessness from this seamless world, absurdly easy, as the toy experiment proves. Stupid kid's toy, Wagnerian Tolkien movie, nil. What can we learn from this? World, a key concept in eco-phenomenology, is an illusion. And objects for sure have a hidden weirdness, as argued by object-oriented ontology. In effect, the stupid kid's toy translated the movie, clashing with it and altering it in its own limited and unique way. Standard ecological criticism depends upon different concepts of world. Indeed, it derives this concept from philosophical thinking about climate, for instance, in the proto-nationalist thinking of Humboldt and Herder, or from biological racism that says I'm white because I was born in a northern climate. This is what Darwin's Descent of Man it's all about, right? It's like, I'm only white because 3 million years ago somebody thought that was sexy, and maybe they only had one choice. This concept is by no means doing what it should do to help ecological criticism. Indeed, the more we see and know about ecology, as is inevitable in an era of ecological crisis, the more of that sheer meaninglessness we have. What an irony. The more data we have, the less it signifies a coherent world. It's Heidegger who, more than anyone else, generates or possibly Michael Jackson did it as well, who more than anyone else generates the concept of world for contemporary ecological philosophy and cultural analysis. In particular, in the question concerning technology and on the origin of the work of art, world is what is created or enframed, Gestell, by equipment, techne. This definition has given rise to the now pervasive doctrine of worlding, whereby cultural artifacts embody the world in various ways. To a hammer, everything looks like a nail, as they say. Now, for a kick-off, there are many reasons why, even if world were a valid concept altogether, it shouldn't be used as the basis for ethics. Consider only this. Which ducking stools constitute a world, just as much as hammers? There was a wonderful world of witch ducking in the Middle Ages. Witch ducking stools constituted a world for their users in every meaningful sense. There is for sure a world of Nazi regalia. Just because the Nazis had a world doesn't mean we should be preserving it. So the argument that it's good because it's constituted in a world is, to use the technical term, bogus. The reason not to interfere with the environment because it's interfering with someone's or something's world is nowhere near a good enough reason. It might even have pernicious consequences, so I'm afraid we must part with Donna Haraway, whose ethics insists that non-humans are worthy of our care and respect because they constitute worlds. They are in the worlding business. I part company with Haraway here, just as she parts company with me, since she thinks that what I'm proposing by contrast is exterminism, getting entities oven-ready for destruction. To which I reply, how can you get an entity that doesn't exist ready for destruction? The second area of concern is historical, namely the way in which current ecological crises such as global warming and the sixth mass extinction event have thrown into sharp relief the notion of world. Now up here we've got Earthrise on the left, and then more radically the pale blue dot, which is the last picture of Earth from Voyager as it left the solar system. It is as if humans are losing their world and their idea of world, including the idea that they ever had one, at one and the same time. This is at best highly disorientating. In this historical moment, the concept world is thrown into sharp relief by circumstances demanding conscious human intervention. Working to transcend our notion of world is important at this moment. Like a mannerist painting that stretches the rules of classicism to breaking point, global warming has stretched our world to breaking point. Human beings lack a world for a very good reason. This is simply because no entity at all has a world, or, as Graham Harman puts it, there is no such thing as a horizon. The world, as the significant totality of what is the case, is strictly unimaginable, and for a good reason. It doesn't exist. What is left if we aren't the world? The song that didn't get sung in the 80s, right? We aren't the world. Intimacy. We have lost the world but gained a soul, as it were. The entities that coexist with us obtrude on our awareness with greater and greater urgency. The Heidegger in me wants to say that it's precisely the magical amazement of things like stones, Beatles, doors, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Nirvana, Bob Geldof, quasars, and cartoon characters in the shape of Richard Nixon's head that are truly what has to be explained, not explained away. Three cheers for the so-called end of the world, then, since this moment is the beginning of history, the end of the human dream that reality is significant for them alone, the prospect of forging new alliances between humans and non-humans alike, now that we have stepped out of the cocoon of world. In 1984, Derek Parfit published the groundbreaking Reasons and Persons, a book that exploded long-held prejudices about utility and ethics from within utilitarianism itself. Parfit's main reason for writing the book was the existence of phenomena such as nuclear radiation and pollution, hyperobjects. What to do about them? Since no one meaningfully related to me will be living 24,100 years from now, the half-life of plutonium, my disposition, cognitive, ethical, political, towards plutonium, must transcend my self-interest, however widely defined. Moreover, hyperobjects last so long that utilitarian concepts such as the social discount rate cannot be ethically or even meaningfully applied to them. Hyperobjects compel us willy-nilly to adopt attitudes for which humans are not well prepared in an age of advanced consumer capitalism. Hyperobjects are messages in bottles from the future. They don't quite exist in a present, for they evacuate the idea of present time, of standard reference points. Their timescale is so much vaster than human lives or human societies that have existed thus far. In order to cope with hyperobjects, we require theories of ethics that are based on scales and scopes that hugely transcend normative self-interest theories, even when we modify self-interest by many orders of magnitude to include several generations down the line or all existing life forms on Earth. In transcending self-interest theories, we need not throw the baby of intimacy out with the bathwater of self. Quite the opposite, in fact. Dropping self-interest theory immediately involves us in what Parfit himself refers to as a more intimate contact with other life forms and with future selves. In a moving passage in the very middle of Reasons and Persons, a passage that is startlingly personal compared with the blisteringly rational mode of Oxbridge utilitarianism that his work exemplifies, Parfit writes, "Is the truth of no self depressing? Some may find it so, but I find it liberating and consoling. When I believed that my existence was a deep further fact, distinct from physical and psychological continuity, and a fact that must be all or nothing, I seemed imprisoned in myself. My life seemed like a glass tunnel through which I was moving faster every year, and at the end of which there was darkness. When I changed my view, the walls of my glass tunnel disappeared. I now live in the open air. There is still a difference between my life and the lives of other people, but that difference is less. Other people are closer. I am less concerned about the rest of my own life and more concerned about the lives of others." Parfit's words themselves exemplify the intimacy and openness to the future that a no-self view bestows. The no-self view is not a faceless, dehumanized abstraction, but a radical encounter with intimacy. What best explains ecological awareness is a sense of intimacy, not a sense of belonging to something bigger, a sense of being close, perhaps even too close to other life forms, of having them under one's skin. Hyperobjects force us into an intimacy with our own death because they are toxic, with others because everyone is affected by them, and with the future because they are massively distributed in time. Attuning ourselves to the intimacy that hyperobjects demand is not easy. As well as being about mind-bending timescales and spatial scales, hyperobjects do something still more disturbing to our conceptual frames of reference. Hyperobjects undermine normative ideas of what an object is in the first place. This sudden turnaround has an uncanny effect. Knowledge about radiation makes us question commonsensical ideas about the utility and benefits of the sun. Unlike sunlight, we can't directly see radiation, yet it affects us far more intensely than visible light. Knowledge about ozone depletion, global warming and radiation have turned ordinary reality into a dangerous place that Ulrich Beck calls risk society, a place in which government policy now involves the distribution of risk across populations, often unevenly. In the long run, no one is exempt from risk. Once we become aware of long-term effects of hyperobjects, we can't abolish this awareness, and so it corrodes our ability to make firm decisions in the present. The fact that we need devices such as computers and Geiger counters to see hyperobjects, objects that will define our future, is humbling in the same way that Copernicus and Galileo brought humans down to earth by insisting that the universe was not rotating around us. In their era, common sense, Palin's favourite phrase, right? Common sense told people that the sun revolved around the earth once a day. Common sense also assured people that weird old ladies who proffered herbal remedies and failed to drown when thrown in water should be burnt because they were witches. Common sense has a lot to answer for. The problem of human society, wrote Jacques Lacan, is what to do with one's own shit. This is, of course, a rather anthropocentric way of putting it. Many non-humans also appear concerned about what to do with their shit. Hyperobjects present us with the same problem, hugely amplified. A styrofoam cup will take about 500 years to biodegrade. Even the massive density of human population itself could be seen as a hyperobject created by technological leaps in agriculture since 1945. What to do about substances that will be around many centuries after our culture has either radically changed or disappeared entirely? The nuclear guardianship movement proposes that radioactive materials such as plutonium, be stored in above-ground, monitored retrievable storage where they are visible and where our decision to have created and used them is in full view, rather than being swept underground or out to sea. It seems highly likely that something like a spiritual culture will emerge around hyperobjects. Accepting this idea does not necessarily imply accepting the need for a secretive atomic priesthood, such as Thomas Sabaoch, his argument, that would prevent others from knowing the truth. The attempt to care for hyperobjects and for their distant future guardians will strikingly change how humans think about themselves and their relationships with non-humans. This change will be a symptom of a gradually emerging ecological theory and practice that includes social policy, ethics, spirituality, and art, as well as science. Nuclear guardianship has suggested encasing plutonium in gold, that precious object of global reverence and lust, rather than sweeping it away out of view. Encased in gold, which has the advantage of absorbing gamma rays, plutonium could become an object of contemplation. Hyperobjects pose problems for self-interest theory that resemble the problems outlined by the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is briefly stated as follows. What would a person do if he or she were a prisoner who was given the choice of remaining silent or betraying another suspect, supposing the following to be the case? 1. If you both betray each other, you will receive 5 years in jail. 2. If one of you betrays and the other one is silent, the betrayed one will receive 10 years in jail. 3. If you both remain silent, you will each get 6 months for a minor charge. Derek Parfit subjects an astonishing array of self-interest theories, variously modified to include relatives, friends, neighbours, descendants, and so on, to numerous tests based on the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma encourages one to think about how change begins. One thinks of the other. One brings the other into decisions that are supposedly about oneself. To this extent, the prisoner's dilemma is formally collectivist, even though it lacks a positive collectivist or socialist content. The kinds of compromise enforced by the prisoner's dilemma may strike ideological purists as weak. It is precisely this weakness that makes the so-called compromises workable and just. Imagine a future self with interests so different from one's own that to some extent she or he constitutes a different self. Not a reincarnation or someone else, you yourself. This person in the future is like the prisoner being interrogated in the other room. The future self is thus unimaginably distant in one sense, and yet hyperobjects have brought her into the adjoining prison cell. She is strange, yet intimate. The best course of action is to act with regard to her. This radical letting go of what constitutes a self has become necessary because of hyperobjects. The ethics that can handle hyperobjects is directed towards the unknown and unknowable future. The future that Jacques Derrida calls l'avenir. This is not the future we can predict and manage, but an unknowable future, a genuinely future, as it were. In the present moment, we must develop an ethics that addresses what Derrida calls l'arrivant, The absolutely unexpected and unexpectable arrival, or what I call the strange stranger, the stranger whose strangeness is forever strange. It cannot be tamed or rationalized away, or even better, what object-oriented ontology calls an object. This stranger or object is not so unfamiliar. In fact, uncanny familiarity is one of the strange stranger's traits. Only consider anyone who has a long-term partner. The person they wake up with every day is the strangest person they know. The future and the strange stranger are the weird and unpredictable entities that honest ecological thinking compels us to think. When we can see that far into the future and that far around Earth, a curious blindness afflicts us, a blindness far more mysterious than simple lack of sight, since we can precisely see so much more than ever. This blindness is a symptom of an already existing intimacy with all life forms, knowledge of which is now thrust upon us, whether we like it or not. To this extent, we are now in a position to realize that everything is a hyperobject, a realization that object-oriented ontology will help us to achieve. Humans must learn to care for substances, fatal substances, that will outlast them and their descendants beyond any meaningful limit of self-interest. What we need is an ethics based on the proximity of the stranger. The decision in the 1990s, rapidly overturned, thank goodness, to squirrel plutonium away into knives and forks and other domestic objects appears monstrous, and so perhaps would any attempt to work it into something convenient. Hyperobjects insist that we care for them in the open. Out of sight, out of mind is strictly untenable. There is no away to which to throw plutonium. We are stuck with it in the same way as we are stuck with our biological bodies. Plutonium finds itself in the position of the neighbor in Abrahamic religions, that awkward place of alien and intimate at the very same time. Now, there's lots of individual hyper art objects that I could talk about now. I'm going to talk about how hyper objects get, into art, become art. For example, there's the Clock of the Long Now, which is a project to put a clock that will last for 10,000 years in the Nevada desert. But I'm only going to focus on one. It's a music one. Music and visual. The suppression of contemplative practices in the West is readily discernible in the history of religious interference with music. It's significant that Pope Gregory, who developed rules for sacred music, banned the augmented fourth, the infamous Diabolus in Musica. The augmented fourth chord is considered sacred in Hindu music precisely because it allows the ear to access a vast range of harmonics, a range that evokes a hugely expanded sense of what in musical language is called timbre, the material that generates a sound, such as the wooden strings and open body of a sitar. And I can't believe that I've got a picture of Mr. Jethro Tull up there doing the one-legged flute dance. I actually can't believe that I've got that, but there you go. The difference between a flute and a sitar, one's made of wood with strings, the other one's made of metal. That's what you hear when you hear that flute sound, right? You hear the metal, you hear the wood of the sitar. What resonates in just intonation, for example, music based on whole number harmonic intervals, such as Indian music, is a profound range of substantiality. The singing of Sanskrit syllables, such as Om, a sound that Hinduism and Buddhism associate with the substantial universe as such, evokes the materiality of the singing body and of the breath that circulates within and outside that body while it remains alive. These syllables are made to vibrate with as subtle and as profound a range of harmonics as possible, evoking the vastness of the universe. Devotional singing, then, is a form of hyperobject, one that meets the intimacy with the other and with the far distant future that hyperobjects such as plutonium force upon us. We discover in the contemplative singing practices of India an expanded materialism that tunes the singer and the listener to the precise timbre of the voice and the body and to the resonant frequencies of the ambience in which the music is played. This materialism is designed precisely to bring the gods to mind, to achieve the intimacy of devotion, bhakti, that is also practiced in esoteric Buddhism. The New York composer Lamont Young one of John Cage's pupils, stumbled upon the notion of attending to objects in a contemplative way almost by accident when he sought a radical break with Western music in the early 1960s. Young decided that the only way to evoke a truly new music was to stop the narrative flow that is normative in Western music, to pull the emergency brake and bring to a shuddering halt the predictable journeys around the world of diatonic harmony and equal temperament. His string trio of 1958 is probably the first minimalist musical composition. Hanging like monoliths in huge, gorgeous swathes of silence, the trio's lapidary chords evoke something more threatening, more intimate and vast than the repetitive riffing of later minimalists, Steve Reich and Philip Glass. It's significant that Reich and Glass have been far more successful in the bourgeois world of luxury products than Young, whose work demands a level of passion and commitment and free time that would probably embarrass and irritate, not to mention disturb, the average middle-class concert-goer. Young's interest in tones began with a fascination with the sound of the transformer in his Turtles aquarium, the hum of the electrics that kept the environment habitable, hence 5865. Day of the Antler from the Obsidian Ocelot, the Sawmill and the Blue Sawtooth high-tension line step-down transformer, refracting the legend of the Dream of the Tortoise, traversing the 189/98 lost ancestral lake region, illuminating quotients from the Black Tiger tapestries of the Drone of the Holy Numbers. A kind of hypertitle, full of objects. In the sonic space, Young's partner Marianne Zazila's calligraphy begins to reveal the tracery of unmeaning that language supposedly transcends. Zazila places writing in structures that employ a fourfold bilateral symmetry, turning script into illegible arabesque that it already is. These fractal squiggles, reminiscent of sound waves seen on oscilloscopes, mark the performance space, illumined with magenta and blue lights that clash in a way analogous to the way in which notes in an augmented fourth clash, producing a supersaturated abundance of radiation. Lamont Young's and Marianne Zazila's work perform what some philosophy calls Stimmung, attunement, which is precisely the way in which the mind becomes congruent with an object. So now, if you could possibly hit play, because I don't think I'm going to be able to do that. If you could just click the speaker symbol, find the speaker symbol, just click that. In particular, Young and Zazila emphasize tuning. Sorry for the abrupt transition there. That's a days-long piece of music there. Emphasize tuning in part by having the music tune itself, insofar as singers and instruments play a fluid sequence of adjustments to a drone. Attunement opens the here and now of light and sound into an infinite light years tracery, Young's phrase, of harmonic frequencies, vibration within vibration, the infinite in substance, on this side of things. The question as to whether there is another side at all is brought sharply into relief, hence the title of Young's masterpiece, The Well-Tuned Piano, and hence also the Indian style of tuning of voice to drone in several other works. So if you could click the speaker on this one, we can have this example. singing the syllable R, as Young and Zazila do, on 31/7/69, 10:26, 10:49 p.m. Map of 49's dream of the two systems of 11 sets of galactic intervals ornamental light years tracery, side one of the so-called Black Album, that Prince didn't do, involves breath, vocal cords, the air around the body, and so on. This is not a realm of abstract presence. This is no world, no Gesamtkunstwerk phantasmagoria of Wagnerian total art. Working directly on sound and light, on tones as such, reveals the emptiness and vastness of timbre, its groundless difference. The Dream House at 275 Church Street, New York, is the building in New York in which Young and Zazila staged very long-term static sound and light works. Thus, even the most stable sine wave generators employed in the sound environment have limitations and produce sonic errors once a year or so. The Dream House is not natural, but supernatural, extra natural, more natural than natural, in the same way that toothpaste says 30% extra. It is bound to its substantiality. Young's art allows us to encounter the inbuilt limits of matter as such, and at the very same time, and for the very same reason, the depth of objects. The art object strives to attune itself to hyperobjectivity. One of Lamont Young's compositions from 1960 involves playing a chord for as long as possible. There have been many versions of this since then, right? The future that this art opens up is highly relevant to enabling us to cope with hyperobjects. Art in this mode does indeed approach an aesthetic transcendence of normative human limits, yet not as Arthur Schopenhauer predicted in his ascetic and horrified version of Buddhism, an escape from samsara into a realm of soothing contemplation. This contemplation, by contrast, is hot, intense, passionate and compassionate, intimate with death and poison, tunneling further into samsara, not seeking a coward's way out, not rejecting substance as evil. Is this not exactly what we need in order to live alongside hyperobjects? We shall be playing the game of coexistence for a very long time. Thanks very much.